Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome. For those who don't know, I'm Dr. Afridi. I'm in the Department of Religion and Philosophy, and also the director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center. I see some of my students, and I don't know some of you. But welcome, and I'm really pleased to see such a nice crowd, especially because of our speakers come from Bosnia, Herzegovina. He and I have been friends because I go to Sarajevo a lot to do work there. But before I say that, this is the last event for us this semester, and then we will start up again in the fall. All of our events are public, they're free, and sometimes when I have a good budget, you get pizza and food on the side. So I promise in the fall, I'll be offering that. And if you're graduating, well, you can still come to my events. So, you know, we have tried to program a lot of issues this semester, starting with looking at difficult conversations today. We've done peacemaking, even about Gaza and Israel. We've done different community events. We've done events on social media. We've done events on the Armenian genocide. And tonight we're gonna look at what are the roots of Bosnian genocide. But having said that, I mean, you have to think of HGI, which is the short acronym that I use for the center, as a home for you, for discussion, for debate. We're located in the library. We have a museum, like a mini exhibit. I don't know if you guys have been there. It's on the 5th floor. Everybody's welcome to go in there. The only reason the door is shut is because we're worried about graffiti or things missing, because these are loaned items from survivors and other people. So we respect that space. So having said that, please look out for the events. We're on Instagram, and we are also on X, and we also advertise around the campus and on announcements. I know you guys don't check announcements, but it's time you should check them out sometimes. You might miss like a good fellowship at HGI. So in the fall, I'm gonna offer like $1,000 for students to apply for, 2 students a semester to come and do some research, but also hold some office hours. It's a really easy job, it's a cushion job. But it's a fun job because you get to like be in charge of a center and help me out a little bit. So without further ado, I wanna introduce Hikmet Karshik, who is from Bosnia. He has a PhD, he has a doctorate and is a research associate at the Institute for the Research of Crimes Against Humanity and International Law at the University of Sarajevo, and author of Torture, Humiliate, Kill Inside the Bosnian Serb Camp System, which was published by University of Michigan in 2022. Now what's interesting is that Hikmet is the first scholar to actually study these camps and look at what was going on inside of these camps. So he is really adding new research and elements to what happened in Bosnia. He was the 2017 Auschwitz Institute Keene State College Global Fellow and has written extensively on genocide denial and atrocity prevention. A sought-after commentator in international media outlets, his articles covering far-right extremism and mass atrocities have appeared in Haaretz, Newsweek, and Foreign Policy. I met Hikmet at a conference where he was just finishing up his PhD, and he just walked up to me and goes, "Hi, I hear you're here, you're Muslim, you work on the Holocaust," and that's how we started to become friends. And I consider him and his family to be my family in Sarajevo. So please welcome Hikmet Karshik.
All right, good evening, and first of all, thank you for such a great turnout, even though it's raining outside and it's almost 7:15 p.m. I promise that this presentation will last around half an hour, and then we'll have around maybe half an hour of Q&A, and yeah, I usually like to hear your questions more than I like to talk. So this is a standard presentation which I usually give when I'm in the US. I come to the US very often, and not that often. I come to the US often, but this is the first time that I'm coming to Manhattan University, and finally we managed to put together both of our programs together. So Professor Afridi and I finally made it to be in the same city at the same time. So yeah. To start off, this is the book which has just been mentioned, published by University of Michigan Press. It is free access, so you can download it through the QR code. It is the first book which has been dealing with the issue of camps in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And the reason why this is interesting is because for the first time in Europe, after the Holocaust, camps were set up in Bosnia. So 50 years of peace in Europe was stopped in 1992 when camps were set up in Bosnia, and I wrote the first book on how these camps functioned. So when we talk about Bosnia and Herzegovina, there are two major things which usually pop up when you do a Google search. One of it is the siege of Sarajevo. This is still, with the war in Ukraine going on, still the longest siege in modern warfare. So the city of Sarajevo, the capital of Sarajevo, was totally cut off from the outside world. The government forces and the population inside was still living for more than 4 years. And the other segment is the Srebrenica genocide, which has been internationally recognized as a genocide by international courts. And something which also happened in 1982 when the war started was these small mini massacres, genocidal campaigns which occurred in towns in eastern Bosnia, as you can see in the picture on the presentation. Now, just to give you a short overview of how the presentation will go to, these are some of the questions which we'll answer through today's presentation, just to give you a sense of, basically this is going to be a crash course on what happened in Bosnia 30 years ago. So when we talk about the social identities of the actors who were involved in the genocide, we need to go and to show you where Bosnia is physically located. Most of you probably already know this, but this is the country of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So it's in the middle of, in the heart of Europe, as we like to say it, and it's quite small. So it's smaller than many. It's probably a third of many of the U.S. states which exist. So it's a small territory. Had around 3.5 million people living there in 1982, and war broke out in 1982, which then went on for 3.5 years. This is the ethnic composition of the country. So Bosnia and Herzegovina is unique in Europe because it was and still is very multi-ethnic and multicultural. So it's one of the rare countries in Europe which has such a balance of different ethnic groups which have been going there for almost 500 years. So for example, we have basically 3 ethnicities living in Bosnia. First are the Croats. The Croats are the Catholics, living there, Roman Catholics. Then we have the Serbs, who are Orthodox Christians, and then we have Bosniaks, who are Muslims. So in 1991, right before the war started, according to the population census, 43% of the country were Muslims, 31% were Orthodox Christians, and 17% were Roman Catholic. And now the thing with these 3 identities is that you have Serbs and Croats and Bosniaks living not only in Bosnia but also in the neighboring countries. So for example, this country is called Serbia, this country is called Croatia, and then you have Croats living in Croatia but also in Bosnia, but then you also have Serbs living in Serbia and in Bosnia, and then you have Bosniaks living in Croatia and Serbia. It's a bit complicated, but that's the fact how it goes to right now. And so this is just to show you the ethnic composition of the country in 1991. As you can see, the green shows you where the Muslims were located in the country. The purple shows where the Serbs were, and the yellow where the Croats, Catholics were. And then the white is where there was a balance. So 50% Muslims, 50% Serbs living. So it was a very, it looks like one of those Picasso pictures. It's a mess, basically. But at the same time, this is a country where for 500 years, people lived together. And so that's one of the very important things to mention here. Now, why was the genocide committed? Now, after World War II, what happened was that the communist partisans won the Second World War, and they were led by this man called Josip Broz Tito, who ruled with an iron fist. And the reason why he ruled with an iron fist was because he brought in a new identity, which he called the Yugoslavs. So he said, we are not Serbs or Croats or Muslims or whatever, we are going to be Yugoslavs right now. And religion and ethnic identity does not play a role, but rather we're all communists. So religion was banned publicly, ethnic identities were also banned, but communism was in the forefront. And so for almost 50 years, the country had, let's say, one of the best times in its history. So the population raised, the economic situation was quite good. And during the Cold War, when this happened, the country was part of the non-aligned movement, so they weren't with the East Bloc or with the West, they were part of a new movement which was started by Josip Broz Tito, in which they basically created a new bloc of non-aligned movements, of non-aligned countries, which composed of countries such as Indonesia, Ethiopia, and so on and so forth. And then with Tito dying in 1980, what happened was that this whole idea of the Yugoslav state started to fall apart. And actually, everybody saw that this idea of Yugoslavia existed as long as Tito existed. So the idea of Yugoslavia started to fall apart once he died. And then in 1986, we have the Serbian intellectuals who were surrounded around the Serbian Academy of Sciences and Arts. They wrote a memorandum in which they falsely accused Kosovar Albanians of discriminating Serbs who are living in Kosovo and Croatia. They were accusing the Kosovo Albanians of creating a demographic bomb, in the sense that they were producing more children than needed in the area, so as to population-wise take control of the country. This is something which you can still hear today, far-right ideologies in Europe, but also in the US, through this so-called Great Replacement theory which exists. So this is the whole concept of it. For those of you who would like to learn more about this time period, there's a really great BBC documentary called "The Death of Yugoslavia." It's about 4.5 hours long, but believe me, it's easier than reading 10 books. So just switch on YouTube, and you get your history crash course on Yugoslavia very quickly. And here, what we see is the man who came after Tito. His name is Slobodan Milosevic. He was later on convicted war criminal. So he was a former communist who became a Serb nationalist overnight for very, very pragmatic reasons. So imagine this: you are 45 years old, your whole lifetime you were a communist, and then in 1990, communism falls. So your whole, let's say, ideology, which you fought for so long, falls apart. And then what do? You take the first thing through which you're able to mobilize masses, and that is nationalism and ethnic hatred. And so that's exactly what Milosevic did. So from being a communist, a person who doesn't like religion or ethnic identity, he becomes a nationalist overnight. And through the documentary, The Death of Yugoslavia, you can see his great speeches being given in front of hundreds of thousands of people. And so he brings back this old ideology called Greater Serbia, which basically means that Serbia is wherever Serbs live. So if there are Serbs living in Manhattan, that's Greater Serbia. If there are Serbs living in Croatia, that's Greater Serbia. So that's the ideology behind Serbian nationalism. And one of the most, let's say, pivotal moments was 1989. So more than 35 years ago, when the 600th anniversary of the Kosovo battle was commemorated. Now, the Kosovo battle, which happened in 1389 in Kosovo, was a battle between the Ottoman Empire the Turks, and Serbian forces. And when you look at Ottoman history, this was a small, insignificant battle. But for Serbian history, this was a huge battle because this is when the Ottomans conquered the region and conquered and destroyed the Serbian Empire. So commemorating the 600th anniversary of the Kosovo battle was a great moment for Milosevic himself to rise up as a leader of the new Serbian state. And then right afterwards, we have 1990, the fall of Yugoslavia, the fall of communism, the fall of the Eastern Bloc, democracy and elections. And what happens in the first elections, the first democratic elections? All those parties which were ethnic-based, which were nationalist, they come to power very quickly. So from a communist state, the country becomes a nationalist hotbed very quickly. And so, for example, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there were three ethnic parties which were set up. It was the Serb Democratic Party, which was the Serb ethnic party. Then you have the Party for Democratic Action, which is the Bosnian party. And then you have the Croat Democratic Community, which is the Croat party. As you can see, all three parties have the word democracy or democratic in them, but they had nothing to do with democracy at all. This was just newspeak, basically. So all of these nationalist parties, they usually tend to have this terminology which usually doesn't reflect what they really stand behind. So in 1991 and in 1991, Slovenia and Croatia, these two small neighboring countries, as you can see right here in the top part, they proclaim independence. And very quickly, the war in Croatia starts because in Croatia you have a large Serbian population living here. And so the war breaks out, which lasts for a few months, and it stops. There's a frozen conflict. And then Bosnia proclaims independence very quickly. And then war, or all hell breaks loose. Now, what was the Serbian ideology behind this? They wanted to create a greater Serbian state in order to take parts of the whole of Bosnia, for example, and parts of Croatia, which they believe belongs to them. And of course, Macedonia here. So as you can see, Kosovo, parts of the whole part of Macedonia, Montenegro, parts of Croatia, they were all supposed to be part of this greater Serbian country. And the three guys who were implementing this criminal plan were Milosevic, the president of Yugoslavia in the middle. This is Radovan Karadzic, he's the president of the Serb politician from Bosnia, and this is Milan Martić, he is the Croat Serb politician from Croatia. So these three politicians, they were the main people, the masterminds behind the genocide. Now, one of the main things when you talk about genocide is intent. So that's probably one of the most difficult things to prove that the people who were firing the guns had the intent to destroy one whole entire nation. But in the case of Bosnia, the Bosnian security forces tapped the telephone lines of certain politicians. And again, you guys are quite young. This was 35 years ago. There were no mobile phones. There was no Instagram. There was no WhatsApp. There was no Facebook. We had these landlines in which you would have these wires tapped to your phones. And usually the phones were tapped physically. So you need to have a spy go into your house, put it into your phone, and then when you talk to your friend overnight, people listen to you. So that's what the Bosnian security forces did. They went inside Karadzic's house, they tapped his phone, and then he late at night would sit down and talk for hours with his friends in Serbia and Bosnia and so on, talking about how he wants to kill Muslims in Bosnia. And we have all this recorded. So for example, Karadzic on the 15th of October 1991, this is the situation when Bosnia decides to go and hold a referendum. He says, they, meaning the Bosniaks, the Muslims of Bosnia, they do not understand that there will be bloodshed and that the Muslim people will be exterminated. They will disappear. That people will disappear from the face of the earth if they insist now. Their only chance was to accept what we had offered them. It was too much, we offered them too much. They offered Bosnians at that time to get one small piece of land, around 30% of the country, a small reservation of sort. Boston's puts it in one belt because we have our own country, multi-ethnic country for a long time. And basically, we had this option of either you accept our terms or we go into genocide. And talks like this, which happened and which are publicly available on YouTube, and if you want, I can share this presentation later on. You can find all these translated telephone lines and listen to them more and talk to them. Now, through my research, one of the things you always try to understand is what is the reasoning behind the mass extermination of people. So in order to kill people, throw them into mass graves and so on, you really need to have a good intention or a good intent behind it and a good reason behind it. Even though if that reason is bad, you need to convince soldiers to kill civilians. So one of the three things which I narrowed down listening to all these, I sat down listening to these telephone lines and to these public speeches and so on, and I analyzed these talks. And the three things which I narrowed down is that Bosniaks or Muslims in Bosnia were categorized as subhuman. Secondly, that we had anti-Muslim bigotry or Islamophobia. And thirdly, that Bosniaks were targeted because of World War II, as revenge for World War II, because in World War II, the Ustasha Croats, they committed a genocide against the Serbs. So these are three things. And how was this committed in such a way? And this is, for me, the most fascinating part. In order to commit genocide in such a society, you need to have a well-organized bureaucratic system. And this isn't only bringing a decision by the military to go and to kill people. You need to have a whole entire structure, a whole entire government behind it. So, for example, the Bosnian Serb political establishment, they created a state within a state. So they didn't go. So they created a state from bottom up. But they did this by creating parallel state institutions within existing institutions. So let's say, for example, what they did at the University of Sarajevo, for example, where I work, is they would come and say, okay, from today, since we are discriminated, we take half of the building and we call it now the Serbian University of Sarajevo. They go to the municipality and say, this is the Serbian municipality of Sarajevo, and they say, okay, half of these chairs belong to us because it's our right, and half of these chairs you can take and do what you want. That's exactly what they did. They came into institutions, they took them over bit by bit. In the beginning, there was a lot of appeasement by Bosnians, and saying, okay, if we give them something, maybe they won't go to the end. If you tolerate them a bit, maybe they won't go to the end. But in the end, what happened was they went into genocide. So they did this in the police and the administration. They even had their own currency printed out. And so war starts on the 1st of March. Bosnia proclaims independence. The flag is risen here on the East River in front of the United Nations. And that's when war hell breaks loose. I was 4 years old when the war started. So we were living in an apartment which had around 10 apartments, one building, 10 apartments. We were good friends with everybody, but one morning you wake up and you find half of your neighbors aren't there. They all left. Half of your neighbors left to see their grandma in Serbia, or half of them left to see their sick grandparents or whatever. So most of them knew what was going to happen, and they left, and they didn't tell us what was going to happen. So this was probably one of the most disturbing parts that you need to understand, that everybody is capable of committing a crime, even if they are your neighbors, your friends, and so on and so forth. So these checkpoints started popping up throughout the town. People were stopped by these. Those of you who watch Ukraine, you see this little green men today in Ukraine, people who had no insignia taking over government buildings and so on. This exactly happened in Bosnia as well. These were all well-trained Serb soldiers who didn't have uniforms, so who didn't want to expose uniforms in the beginning. And the first cities which were hard hit were those which were on the border. So these are several of these towns. My dad's family is from Višegrad, in eastern Bosnia. So they were the first hit on 6th of April 1982. And you see Sarajevo is right here. That's Sarajevo, the capital. So the cities on the border were the first hit, and this took several weeks and months for them to fall. There was a little resistance, and then this whole area was quote-unquote ethnically cleansed. one of the most brutal aspects of the war in Boston was the indiscriminate bombardment of civilian positions inside the city. So civilian buildings, libraries, for example, this building you see up here is the National Library, which was burned down. So 2 million books were destroyed in one night. And again, this is, we're talking about 35 years ago. This is before we had scanners, before we had the possibility to scan stuff. So 2 million books which burned down, they're destroyed forever. They don't exist anymore. The reason why libraries were targeted was because if you want to destroy a nation, you don't destroy it only by killing people, you destroy it by burning down their buildings, their cultural heritage, their libraries, any written documents that these people ever existed. That's exactly what happened here. And so, this is one of the military plans of the Bosnian Serbs. What were their main objectives in taking over Bosnia? And then this concept of ethnic cleansing popped up in 1982. That's interesting. Like for you guys who study genocide or read about genocide studies and so on, you'll come across this term ethnic cleansing. And what is interesting is that this term doesn't have any legal sources whatsoever. No legal foundation. The reason why ethnic cleansing was put into use was because in 1992, when the war in Bosnia started, when the genocide started, the United Nations, in Bosnia, but also in Rwanda, invented a term called ethnic cleansing so that they don't have to interfere in the country. Because if you use the term genocide, then you have the moral obligation, but also under the UN Charter, the Charter on the Resolution on Genocide, to militarily interfere and to prevent the genocide from happening. So by creating a new term, newspeak, I call it ethnic cleansing, which is nothing less or nothing more than genocide. You created a new term which you could use publicly, which you could use officially, but which didn't give you any legal obligations to do anything. And so these are the 5 segments of ethnic cleansing. And as you can see, these are the destruction of mosques, for example, the burning of villages, as you can see right here. So this was done in a very quick fashion. 2-3 hours, a whole entire village would be destroyed. Most of the men would be killed, the women and children would be sent to concentration camps, and the houses would be looted and burned down. Again, we go back to the dehumanization aspect. So when we talk about dehumanization, it's really important to understand the reason why somebody targets a specific victim group. And so here I went through all the Bosnian Serb documentation to try and to figure out some of these reasons, and this is one of my favorite things which I found. Luka Dragicevic, who is the assistant commander for morale, religion, and legal affairs in the Sarajevo Romania Corps. This was the unit of the Bosnian Serbs which encircled Sarajevo. He wrote in a letter which was read out to the soldiers. So Sarajevo was under siege and in a circle, and the Bosnian Serb soldiers were conducting sniper fire on civilians, but also bombarding the city indiscriminately. And so Luka Dragicevic, their assistant commander, comes up and gives them a speech, a motivational speech on what to do and why to do these things. And so he tells them, we are genetically stronger, better, handsomer, and smarter. Remember how many Muslims there were among the 10 best pupils, students, soldiers? A precious few. Why? Because they are Poturice. And only the weakest among the Serbs became Poturice. Now, the term Poturice is important here to understand. It's a Bosnian term or a Slavic term. Poturice means Turkifier, or a person who becomes Turk, a Turkish man. But when we say Turk, in this sense, it means to become a Muslim. What does this mean? 500 years ago, when the Ottoman armies came to the region in the Balkans, a lot of the local Slavic population converted to Islam. These were former pagans, people who believed they had their own faith, which they called Bosnian Church. They were praying in nature, and not believing in they believed in the oneness of God and things like this. And so when Islam came to the region, they found it pretty acceptable, and they converted to Islam. Serbian ideology states that these were all Serbs who converted to Islam. So because you converted to Islam 500 years ago, today you must be punished for this. So this is the ideology of Kotlice. So for example, my family has been living in Bosnia for almost 600 years, definitely, according to the state records. And my family converted to Islam in the 15th century. And so today, in 1982, my family was targeted by Serb soldiers because my great grandparents converted to Islam. It's very funny, but it was acceptable by Serb soldiers to bombard the hell out of a city because somebody somewhere a long time ago converted to Islam. That's the term of Potritsa. So, for them, let's say, an acceptable Muslim would be a Syrian, a Pakistani, a Nigerian, but not the Slavic Bosnian Muslim. So there's a racial segment to this ideology. So their ideology is that if you're a Muslim, you have to come from the East. You have to be a Turk to come from there to be a Muslim. Europe is only for Europeans. Europe is only for the white Christians. So that's the ideology of what it said. And another statement which is quite chilling is by Biljana Plavšić. She was the most. When we talk about these perpetrators, usually think that these are only men and so on. Biljana Plavšić was a female scholar. She worked at the University of Sarajevo, so at the same university where I worked. She worked there. She was a professor of biology. The professor of this book, professor of biology, she says that's true. The Bosnian Muslims were actually Serbs. It was genetically deformed material that embraced Islam. And now, of course, with each successive generation, this gene simply becomes more concentrated. It gets worse and worse. It simply expresses itself and dictates their style of thinking and behaving, which is rooted in their genes. So basically what she says is that Bosnian Muslims, or people who converted to Islam 500-600 years ago, are genetic scum, which needs to be gotten rid of. And this is stated by a professor of biology, one of the most high-ranking Bosnian Serb officials in the Bosnian Serb Party. So this is just to get you the context behind the ideology of the perpetrators, which led to this, the camps. Now, when you commit the genocide, one of the easiest ways to commit the genocide is just to, kill everybody at one time, bombard them, send them in gas chambers and so on. What happened in Bosnia was a slow motion killing. So it took months. People were brought into camps and were kept there for months. They were starved to death. This was done in a very brutalist, theatrical fashion. And then the other aspect, and this is all happening in Europe, this is all happening 800 kilometers from Vienna, 800 kilometers from 1,000 kilometers from Venice. We're talking about the heart of Europe. We're not talking about an area which doesn't get media attention. We're talking about an area, a country which hosted the 1984 Sarajevo Winter Olympic Games. We're talking about the country which people knew about in Europe because everybody was coming down from Poland, from Germany, from Britain, from the Czech Republic, down through Bosnia into the Croatian coast for years. So, and they allowed this to happen in the middle of Europe. And so one of the things which was most interesting is that new detention or facilities were set up in existing areas. So for example, this hotel up here called Vilna Vas was a hotel which was converted into a rape camp by Bosnian Serb soldiers, which is located in eastern Bosnia. And I write about this in my book. And there were around 200 women and girls who were inside this hotel. Only around less than 10 survived the camp. So most of them were killed after being raped multiple times. And of course, this is the image which caused public outrage worldwide. And this was published by actually a newspaper in New York. So the story of the camps in Bosnia was uncovered by Roy Gutman, a journalist who worked for Newsday, which was coming out in New York. The newspaper doesn't exist anymore, but this is the image which ended up on Time magazine, on Newsweek, all over the news. And for you, what is the most chilling part here in the photograph? Why do you think it caused such outrage? I mean, there's one aspect that, for 50 years, these images weren't there, but what else? What do you see in the image?
He's smiling. Kind of.
He's smiling because he's happy to see journalists, but what else? What does this remind you of?
It looks like people that are, desperate to get out, packed together behind like bars, as if, like you said, dehumanization.
But any historical context here?
Yeah, what does it remind you of?
Go ahead.
It kind of reminds me of the Japanese internment camps or the Nazi concentration camps in World War II.
Exactly, that's it. The first time in Europe after 50 years, we have camps which resemble the Nazi camps. People behind barbed wire, smiling, happy to see foreigners starved to death, and this is happening in the middle of Europe in 1982. So this camp, for example, was established in May until August 5th. So you can count how many months that is, and you can count to what extent this man was starved to death. And so these people, if these camps weren't uncovered by the journalists on the 5th of August, imagine if the camps were uncovered in September or October, how many people would have died more in these camps? And then the other aspect, so now I'll skip several years and go to one of the most horrific parts of Bosnian genocide, that is Srebrenica, which is the most famous one, the most infamous one. So in eastern Bosnia, there were 3 enclaves where people, Bosniaks who escaped from other towns, came and concentrated themselves around 3 UN designated safe areas. That's also another term newspeak by the UN. They created these zones, which they called safe areas, which weren't safe. They were in no way safe. These were small areas which had UN troops inside, but which didn't have the mandate to protect the people inside. So they were there just as observers. And so Srebrenica was located there, and there were around 40,000 people inside. They were mainly people from all over the surrounding villages who came inside and managed to defend themselves. And this small city of small town of Srebrenica with its surrounding villages was attacked by the Bosnian Serbs on the 11th of July, actually on the 10th of July 1985. And after one day, the town fell. And the Bosnian Serb general, when he entered the city, he said, "The time has come to take revenge on the Turks of this region." Again, this terminology, Turks, is always mentioned there. And what people who survived in 1992, people who survived the camps and so on, people who knew about what was going to happen, many of the men decided at the time not to surrender to the Serbs, but rather to create a column let's say, a column of men which would trek through the woods towards safe territory, which was Bosnian government-controlled territory, which is around 100 kilometers away. And so this column, called the March of Death, this is one of the rare photographs from the March of Death. This is, they managed to, after almost 6 days, to come to the free territory, or the Bosnian government-controlled territory. One of the things you can see in this column is that out of 15,000 men, how many were there in the column? Almost 1/3 was armed. The rest were all civilians. There were people from 14 years old to 77. So even the elderly didn't want to surrender. And as you can see in the images here, they're all civilians. They had no military equipment. They didn't have any guns. If they had guns, they probably would have fought, but they didn't. So they were basically stuck. And after 3.5 years being in the middle of nowhere, in eastern Bosnia, with no food, electricity, or running water, these people were really exhausted through the World War, and then this was the final punch, basically, in July 1985. most of the others, most of these people, these men were caught. They were systematically executed over the next couple of days. So in basically a matter of 5 days, from July 11th to July 16th, 8,372 men and boys were executed and thrown into large mass graves, which are the size of these football fields behind us. To make things more interesting, this whole process was covered by spy planes. So the Western countries knew what was going on from minute to minute. NATO knew about this, the United Nations knew about this. And here what you can see is the 17th of July 1995. So the 16th was the day when the executions ended. 17th in the afternoon, this is around 4 or 5 p.m. You can see a bulldozer. So the man has just finished digging, making a mass grave here and here. And he's basically going home now for lunch in the bulldozer. He finishes the day's work. These small squares you see here are all Muslim houses which have been burned down. So when a roof burns, this is what happens when you look at it from an aerial point of view. So, and as you can see, the mass graves were, the people were dumped into these mass graves. They weren't properly buried. Their bodies were just dumped inside. And so what happened afterwards? For the last 30 years, the Bosnian authorities have been digging up these mass graves and conducting DNA analysis for each victim. Because it's impossible to identify any of these victims. So for each body, you need to take a blood sample from the family members. You need to take an extract from the bones, and then you do DNA matching to see who the victim is. And so out of 8,372 victims, we have so far found around 7,000. So we are still looking for around 1,500 people who are missing and who are buried somewhere in the woods around Srebrenica. So when we talk about responses, I told you the UN was stationed inside Srebrenica. These were Dutch peacekeepers. They didn't really do a good job. There were around 200, 300 of them were based inside, but they did leave behind a lot of graffiti on the walls in their living quarters. So this is one of the most infamous graffitis. And again, here you can imagine this 3.5 years. You have no possible living conditions inside the city. You can imagine how the hygienic situation was inside, and then you have these kind of graffitis put up by UN soldiers who are there supposedly to keep the peace. And this man up here, he was a UN translator called Hasan Luhanovic. He's still alive. He tried to protect his family, his mother, father, and younger brother, by hiding them inside the UN base. And the Dutch peacekeepers basically forced him to kick out his family members, and which were handed over to the Bosnian Serbs, and they all ended up in 3 different mass graves. He then sued the UN in front of an international court and got them at the court. So how does a genocide usually end? Many different ways, but one of the things I always like to talk is about this U.S. response to genocide, which wasn't a black and white thing. One of the most interesting parts about the U.S. response to Bosnia was that there were elections in 1982. We imagined George W. Bush was still in power. And then Bill Clinton came afterwards. So during the Bush administration, there wasn't much things done. Actually, one of his national security advisors said, "We don't have a dog in this fight," meaning that they have no interest in Bosnia, so they didn't do much at all. After the public images of the camps and the victims popped up in the U.S. media, there was a lot of bipartisan support for Bosnia in the Congress. So, for example, one of the hawks was Frank McCloskey from Indiana, a man who had no previous relationship to Bosnia, who never visited Bosnia at all, became a vocal advocate for Bosnia. Also, Joe Biden, Joe Lieberman, John McCain, these were all people who were fiercely supporting Bosnia and calling for something which they called lift and strike, lift the arms embargo on Bosnia and strike Bosnian Serb positions. And so on August 30th, 1995, NATO starts a bombing campaign against Serb positions after they massacred around 70 people in the city of Sarajevo at the marketplace. And after a few days of bombardment, the Serbs basically asked for a ceasefire. So it took very little to force them onto the negotiation table. And this brings us to the Dayton Peace Accords on the not exactly, but almost 30 years ago this year, which was signed in Dayton, Ohio, in the US. And this year there will be a commemoration there in May, because Mike Turner, who's right now representing Dayton or Ohio, was the governor of Dayton in 1995. And so what are the legacies? One of the interesting things, and one of the things which actually got me into all of this work was that an international tribunal was set up in 1983 to prosecute the crimes which were committed in Bosnia and in the former Yugoslavia. And so out of this court had almost 160 individuals indicted. There were people who were convicted for genocide, rape, wartime rape was proclaimed a crime against humanity, a war crime. So a lot of things in the legal sense were quite good were quite well defined by the ICTY, by the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. And a lot of attention was given to witness testimonies, to transcripts, to documentation, which I still use and which will probably be used for the next 40, 50 years by researchers. And there was also another court case when Bosnia sued Serbia for genocide, ICJ, in 2006, 2007. Srebrenica was found as a genocide, but other cases such as the camps did not meet the definition of genocide according to the International Court. When we talk about recognition, Srebrenica has been recognized as a genocide by last year, most recently by the United Nations General Assembly. Before that, one of the resolutions was vetoed by Russia in 2015. That's another topic we can talk about. But we also have the Senate resolution, the House resolution 2005, the European Parliament 2009, and interestingly, Serbia was forced as a country to adopt the resolution in 2010. But you can see how they evaded the use of the term genocide in 2010 by stating the Parliament of Serbia strongly condemns the crime committed against the Bosnian Muslim population of Srebrenica in July 1995 as determined by the International Court of Justice. And with that, I end my presentation today, and yeah, I look forward to your questions, and I'm sorry for speeding through 3.5 years in almost, I think, how many minutes, but yeah, thank you so much.
We'd like to open it up for questions, anything that comes to mind. Yeah. Do you have a question?
Yeah, whatever you guys are interested in, if you need something explained better, yeah?
For the aerial pictures that you,
That's just a gem.
Okay.
the aerial pictures that you said, that you showed, you said that was from like NATO knowing and that was from like the satellites, or, so how long did you say they knew this was going on for?
So, during the whole war in Bosnia, and
Can you
probably-
repeat the question for everyone?
Yes, so the question is about the aerial images which I showed earlier. How long did we know about it, and how long was it happening? Well, basically, the aerial images were taken every 20 minutes or hour by satellite, but later on also by these first drones which were set up. But it wasn't real time, but you could get like an image every 20 minutes, every hour from different areas. So what would happen was that these spy satellites would take images of different areas, portions of the country every hour, and you could see the developments on the ground. The problem is some of these satellite images still are not publicly accessible, and they probably will be maybe in 100 years, but probably most of the Western countries knew what was going on the whole time.
My question is like, you said that you were 4 years old when the war started, so my question to you is like, how was your childhood with all of this going on?
I was one of the lucky ones. We lived near the airport, so the airport was one of the first areas to be taken control of. And so once our certain neighbors left, telling us that they left, we also left the apartment because my dad was intellectual and he was on the kill list basically to be executed. So we left the area, and my dad stayed behind, and I went to Turkey to live, to Istanbul, and then he managed to get out like after a year, and then we ended up in Malaysia and Kuala Lumpur, far away. So we weren't really affected by the war itself. We were affected in the sense that a lot of our family members were in camps, some of them were killed and so on. And then we returned after the war to live there and to help rebuild the country in such a way. But luckily, I mean, my family directly was not affected by any of this.
In your slide about the U.S. response, you have Biden's name on the slide. Why is that?
So at the time, he was a congressman, he was senator at the time. Senator, and he was very vocal about Bosnia. So he was very tough on that. He was one of the hawks of the Hill, and so he, Joel Lieberman, Bob Dole, Frank McCloskey, John McCain, they were really. It was a really good bipartisan group which was supporting Bosnia at the time. So he was really vocal about it. Okay.
Why do you think there's an American journalist versus like a European or like someone closer to the point? Why was it an American journalist that broke the story?
That's interesting. Like, I mean, imagine you fly in from New York to come to the middle of Bosnia, and you have all these German, British journalists who are not interested. Most of Europe wasn't interested in the story. Whatever was a little far away somewhere going on. But Roy Gutman had a personal thing. Roy Gutman is an American Jew. His family survived the Holocaust. So when he heard these stories, he was interested to see whether this is true. Because many people didn't believe it in the beginning. They all thought it was Boston propaganda or whatever. So he wanted to see it himself. When he came there, when he heard the stories, he was just. He still lives in New York City. He's here, and he was really passionate afterwards about the whole situation. But he was really brave. I mean, this was the first 2 months of the war. I mean, it's really difficult to come into Boston, but he managed to come through, and he came with a photographer, a European photographer, which he commissioned, and they took some really interesting photographs of the camps. Yeah.
How outnumbered were like the Muslims from like the Syrians?
So, as I mentioned in the beginning, the Muslims were around 43% of the country, the Serbs were around 39%, but the Bosnian Muslims didn't have an army. The Serbs were supported by Serbia, by a neighboring country, which basically sent the whole army, tanks, and everything else. So Bosnians really, in the beginning, had only like a rebel army, like a guerrilla, which then became a real army only after 3 years.
And like just like following the Holocaust, like I guess my question is kind of like, why did they decide to like stand up against like the Serbians?
I don't know. I mean, we have this. Bosnians managed to survive. Bosniaks, or Bosnian Muslims, managed to survive so many different empires and states throughout history. We're just like that. I don't know. We're just resilient to a large extent. And many Bosnians didn't believe that a war was going to happen because they believed it was a thing from the past. So there were always groups of people who were very, let's say, knowledgeable, who knew or had a sense of what was going to happen. But also you had people who survived World War II. And World War II was quite difficult in Bosnia. I mean, there wasn't a mass killing on the extent like the Holocaust, but there was a lot of mass killings on all sides. So for example, my great-grandma, she was born in 1900. In 1915, she was a refugee during World War I. And so World War I started in Sarajevo. I think you guys know this, right? So Gavrilo Princip assassinated Franz Duke Ferdinand.
You can go to see where he was assassinated.
Yeah, so when you come to Bosnia, you can see the spot where World War I started. So my great grandma was a refugee in 1915. Then she was a refugee in 1943. And then in 1992, she was 92 years old when she was a refugee for the third time. So you have this, let's say, many family histories which have this oral history brought down from one person to the other. And then, for example, like, one of the interesting things I see here when I come to the US is I meet many families who have like family trees and photographs of, you know, when they came to the US and stuff like that. We don't have this in Boston because most of our private archives, family archives, were burned down in one war, in some war. So we've been having this going on for a long time, and I think people are always somehow vigilant and trying to get ready for some sort of defense. You know? Even these days, I mean, we know that Ukraine is going on. It might stop soon, but maybe it might spill over into Bosnia. So we're always, you know, trying to figure out how to survive in such a circumstance.
I know you said that the Serbians were trying to target.
You just speak up.
I know you were saying that the Serbians were targeting the Muslims that sort of look like them. I was just wondering, in your research, if you found the plans after to attack Muslims outside the area.
Outside the?
Outside of the area, were they planned for
Ah.
Serbs to attack Muslims outside?
No, not really. They were planning to only to attack people who were living in Bosnia itself. Their aim was to take the territory of Bosnia and to get rid of the Muslims from Bosnia. That was their plan. Their aim.
Yeah, I was just saying, like, I was wondering if, like, after that, like, plans after, they were just talking about the area.
Oh, so when it comes to Serb nationalists, they didn't really have plans like the German Nazis had. These guys were improvising a lot. First they said, so they had these plans which were published in the official gazette. So for example, and you know, this is a lot of, they didn't say, you know, we're gonna go kill all Muslims in the city, but they would say, we need to establish a corridor in the Drina River Valley that is to eliminate the Drina at the border separating certain states. Now, you need to have knowledge of Bosnia to understand this. This is the Drina River. That's a big river dividing Bosnia and Serbia. And so you have a lot of Muslims living here, almost 80% right here. So this is where my dad's family is from, Bashir. And so when you say eliminate the Drina as the border separating Serb states, so that means that if you have a Serb state here, and if you have a Serb state here, the only border which is separating them are the Muslims living here. So this is like a well-packaged sentence to say, let's get rid of the Muslims from this area. And this was established by the ICTY, so I didn't come up with this. This is something which the ICTY said, this is genocidal intent when it comes to the whole of Eastern Bosnia. So these were their plans in the beginning. To get rid of Muslims from here, to get rid of them up to here, so this would belong to Croatia, and this would belong to Croatia, and this would all be Serbia here. So the Muslims would either end up in this area or in Croatia or be kicked out from the whole country. So that was their plan from the beginning, and they were acting the way that, you know, we do step number one, then we decide on step number two, then step number three. So there was also a lot of improvisation, like in all genocides. Any more? Yes?
Why do you think that this isn't talked about, I guess, today as much as it should be?
Sorry?
Why do you think this isn't talked about, like, even today as much as it should be?
For several reasons. First, we have to be self-critical. I mean, Bosnians don't like to work. I'm the second guy from Bosnia who wrote a book about genocide in English language. We have written tons of books in Bosnian, but if you want to get it to Manhattan, you need to write it in English. We make it open access and so on. Second thing is that, unfortunately, this hasn't gotten into the curriculums of Western countries yet. They're slowly trying to put it out there. Thirdly, we have a very complicated country today. So that's something which I didn't talk about, but today we are still living together. All of us are still living together. So there's a lot of, let's say, an embargo on certain issues which we shouldn't talk about. Like for peace sake, we won't be talking too much about genocide. That's the kind of things that we're being told right now. So only last year did we get this, UN resolution on Srebrenica, and that's a huge thing, because it's after the Holocaust in Rwanda, is the third thing to manage to be lobbied from the UN. So I think this is just a thing of, it's also a generational thing. So for example, you probably heard this from your professors and from Dr. Rafidi, Jews didn't talk about the Holocaust until the late 1970s. It's a long time. It's a traumatic thing to talk about after surviving. But just look around here. How many Bosnians are here? There are no Bosnians. You all got invites. Because Astoria is too far away, you know. They're all in Greece, Astoria. I don't know. They don't want to, this is all boring, you know, about that. So that's the mentality we should have, you know, and that's something that's a generational thing. So I expect this happened to the Jews as well in Israel after the Second World War and in the US as well. It took them almost 2 generations to get interested in Africa. And then once they get interested, then you'll get it into the universities, you'll get it everywhere else. But I think that's my reasoning behind it. So I don't know. Yeah.
What was the main reason that motivated you to write the book?
What's your question?
What was the main reason which motivated me to write the book? So this was my PhD thesis, which I converted into a book. But the reason why I did it was because I remember the pictures very well. So I had this magazine cover to this day, Time magazine, the picture of the man behind the wire. You know, I had it all. Where is it? I still have it at home, and this is something which really affected me during the war because I remember this image very well. I still have it. I have it in my office actually on the wall. That's one thing. The other thing is probably my family history. My grandma, 92 years old, she died in Macedonia, which is a small country. That's where she was buried. And you know, one of the things you need to realize in some parts of the world is that we don't take things for granted. I know that I was born in Yugoslavia, so I have a Yugoslav passport. Then I have a Bosnian wartime passport, and now I have a Bosnian passport. There are 3 passports already from 3 different countries. So who will guarantee to me that I will die in Bosnia? Maybe a World War will break out and Bosnia will exist. In Europe, there will be a nuclear war, who knows? So many things that happen. So that's how we grow up thinking. We have to be original, we have to think about little things, and yeah, that's what got me into writing this. Because I didn't figure anybody else was gonna write it, and I was really angry at my fellow scholars, countrymen, and so on. Because it took me 30 years, I mean, not me, but I had to grow up and do my studies and so on to do it. Books somebody else should have done it already. So that's one of the things. Yes.
Did you find some walls, some people who say has stopped doing that or something like this?
Sorry.
Do you find barriers from speaking about it?
Oh, of course. Yeah, so you will always find people who don't want to talk about it, who are either too traumatized or too, I don't know. People like to move on from certain traumatic, which is understandable, I mean, totally understandable. But what was good for me was that I have access to the International Tribunal archives, so I managed to get all the witness statements from them. So I didn't have to go and do interviews with people, which was good, because I don't like doing interviews with survivors. It's really re-traumatizing for them. And so I managed to get all of these witness testimonies, which are written down, which are well taken, and plus I had documentation from the Serbian side. So I managed to write a book which is completely focused on Serbian wartime documentation, and so I didn't have to, you know, I didn't have a lot of contact this way. I think I saw one more hand somewhere. Oh.
How old were you when you knew you wanted to dedicate your time and efforts to study this and uncover what was really happening?
I'm gonna sound really weird, but since I knew, I mean, since probably 9, 10 years old. I mean, my parents were always pushing, I have two more brothers, they were always pushing us into the IT stuff, you know, go make money and stuff like that. We all ended up in history and stuff like that. So, you know, listen to your parents next time. So yeah, I mean, I don't know, I think it's just a time when I grew up in a specific time with specific, so I grew up in a country where I got a lot of Western media, so CNN was there, Time Magazine was there. So, and then my friends who grew up in Bosnia after the war, they didn't have all this. They got different information from Boston TV. And here I got the Western, let's say, vision of events. And so this made me realize that I should write something and work on this, taking both points of view together and combining it into a book which would be accessible to the West, to foreign audience, but using Boston storytelling, let's say. So that was my end goal. And I'm too old for a job change right now, so.
Also, I mean, I wanna add that there are Bosnian scholars in the United States and in Europe both. They're not necessarily Bosnian, right?
Yeah.
They're Holocaust scholars, they're not necessarily Jewish,
Yeah.
vice versa. I have one question for you, I know, so we know that there are tensions right now around Bosnia. Of course, you talked about Ukraine, Russia, right there, Serbia, is having its own issues. Yet, it's been called genocide, right? Took a long time, but it's been called genocide. And then I just wanna switch gears, so there's Rwanda, which has also been called genocide. And where there's, again, killing going on in Rwanda, as you know, people taking the Congo.
Yeah.
So what do you think is important about genocide being recognized internationally? I guess that's a big question that I actually ask myself that all the time. Yeah.
That's a great question, because like in the case of Rwanda, and that's I think one of the things, how does a genocide end? That's one of the crucial parts here. In Rwanda, genocide ended by military victory. You know, Kagame and his forces got into Kigali and they liberated the country and they set up something which is a semi-military dictatorship, let's say. I was in Rwanda last year, so I saw it firsthand. The case of Bosnia, what we had was a frozen conflict. The war ended by an international peace agreement. We had international forces. We had 60,000 American forces coming from 1986 to 2000 to implement the peace. And so they came there and said, okay, now, you know, all the things of the past will be dealt by the ICTY. And also the Bosnians said, you know, that's one of the very interesting aspects, that Bosnian Muslims, even though they went through all of this, they never had a single act of revenge. This is what I always like to mention. So there was not a single act of revenge. So the Bosnian Islamic scholars, they said, we want justice, not revenge. So we're going to ask for justice and recognition through international courts, or through courts. And I think this was a very good way, a very good path, because by getting something internationally recognized, it wasn't easy at all. I mean, in 1982, nobody believed us. In 1986, nobody believed us. I mean, we had to prove genocide in Bosnia through forensic, state-of-the-art forensic results. We're talking about DNA analysis. There's no other genocide in the world which has this. So all the people who are buried in Srebrenica are, for each victim we have a DNA analysis there, DNA report. It took us 30 years to get this. We had to get documentation, build up documentation, do everything. And then once you get this, it takes time, but it's also satisfaction in the end. I think this is a good basis to set up a new pro-war society later on. Because if you have a situation like in Rwanda where only the victory, the people of victory are there to establish the official narrative and everything else, then I'm afraid that the circle of violence will pop up again sometime in the future. Whereas in Bosnia, I'm hopeful that, and I see this in the local, among my local students and so on, recognizing the facts which were court established is something which may help heal the whole society. So I think that's very important. And we shouldn't rush in documenting any war crimes, any war atrocities, wherever they happen in the world. This all needs to be well documented, all needs to be well written and recognized in the end. So.
Great. Any other questions, comments? Should we relieve him from this great lecture? Well, thank you so much. Do me a favor, fill out those evaluations quickly. They're not really long to fill out because I want to assess myself all the time. So that helps me to give you better programming.